To introduce myself, my name is Shahir. I am a senior social protection specialist for the Middle East and North Africa at Development Pathways. I'm also leading the Inclusive Social Security Policy Forum for MENA region, which is a network and space for civil society organizations and individuals across the MENA region that challenges the dominant narratives around social security, aims to build evidence about the importance of inclusive social security in the region, and works to strengthen the capacities of civil society in the region to demonstrate the effectiveness and importance of inclusive social security systems. We are happy to welcome you all today to our panel under the title, Building a New Eco-Social Contract and Advancing Social Securities in Times of Debt and Austerity. The panel is sponsored by more than 18 organizations, of whom some are present with us today. This panel is also part of a global campaign calling for social security for all, where 70 organizations already have signed the campaign declaration so far. This call and campaign are stemming out of a core belief that an inclusive, right-based social security system is an essential element in any successful and sustainable economy and a central condition to building a strong social contract and a cohesive society. This call is also happening, and as the campaign statement reads, with cascading crises from the pandemic to conflict and climate breakdown, exposing social tensions and deepening fractures arising from an economic approach that has emphasized growth with little regard to human rights, equitable distribution of resources, or the environment. The erosion of public services, social security protection, and labor rights have increased inequality and enabled an elite few to capture the vast majority of global resources, posing one of the most threats to human rights of our time. High-income countries invest on average 16.4% in GDP in social security, establishing systems that support people across the life cycle, covering children, older people, people with disabilities, unemployed, and survivors, and usually through schemes offering universal access on the basis of citizenship. In many low and income countries, and in large part due to IFI conditionalities, different approach has been adopted. In the MENA region where I come from, for instance, the average investment does not exceed 6.2%, and in the Arab region specifically, it does not exceed 4.6%. We find many low and middle income countries with deteriorating social insurance schemes in place, mainly provided to those in the formal economy, while the rest of the population is only offered poor quality programs for the poor with transfer values that are often too low, a selection process that is highly inaccurate, arbitrary, and often demeaning. In those countries, they often implement a targeting mechanism known as the proxy means test, which across the world has proven to fail with exclusion error normally above 50% of the eligible population, yet IFIs remain to say it's not ideological. The dominant social security paradigm across many low and middle income countries, therefore, is worsening social security schemes for the better off, poor quality social assistance for the poor, while the large population, the large majority, a large proportion of the population living in middle incomes is excluded from social security. If social contract and social cohesion are to be strengthened in our world today, a paradigm shift in the design of national social security systems is required, with a move towards building systems for all citizens based on the right of social security for all. And here comes our panel, where we will hear further from them about this reality and the realistic alternatives to build social security for all. We have with us today Sarah Saadoun, senior researcher and advocate on economic justice and rights at the Human Rights Watch, and author of a recent report on IMF lending, titled Bandage on Bullet Wound, IMF Social Spending Floors and the COVID-19 Pandemic. We also have Dr. Isabel Ortiz, Director of the Global Social Justice Program at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, former Director at the United Nations International Labour Organization and UNICEF. And we also have Elana Kimbabazi, sorry if I'm not pronouncing it well, an expert on socioeconomic rights in Uganda and Program Manager for the Initiative for Economic and Social Rights, heading the Economic Justice and Social Protection Program there. And last but not least, Dr. Rodrigo Cerda, who will be joining us online. He's the Division Chief of Expenditure Policy at the IMF and ex-Minister of Finance in Chile. We also invited the World Bank to participate. However, they unfortunately declined our invitation. We now will kick off with Sarah Saadoun, who will present the recent Human Rights Watch that analyzes IMF loans that was approved from March 2020 at the start of COVID until March 2023 to 38 countries with a total of population of 1.1 billion, and the impact of these loans on people, economic, social, and cultural life. Sarah, you have 10 minutes.
Is the mic working?
Yeah, now it's working.
Okay, thank you very much, Shahir, and to everybody for coming to this talk. I'd like to begin with a video so that we can hear from somebody who is affected by these loans in Sri Lanka.
ඒ තවසේ දේවල් ඔක්කොම ඉහළ යනවා කියලා කරගන්න කිල්ලයක් නැතුව තමයි ඉන්නේ මේ. ඒතකොට දැන් ගොඩාක් අහන්න වැඩි වුණා කියලා මට.
How would you pay for your expenses if they suddenly increased by 50% in the middle of an economic crisis? For Shanti, that is a reality. She, like many others in Sri Lanka, has been directly affected not only by inflation, but also by conditions attached to an International Monetary Fund bailout. The IMF loan program conditions disproportionately affect people with low incomes worldwide. For example, by asking for cuts to public spending that affect them, or taxes that increase the costs of basic goods and services. The IMF says they are balancing the impacts of these conditions by requiring governments to invest a minimum in some areas of social spending and by improving social security systems. But this isn't quite working.
මම වර වත් වැට කියන්නේ එතකොට සඩින් බඩු ගන්නවා මේ මාසෙකට ගන්නවා පොතට අරන් මාසේ පඩි අරන් පොත මම දැන් අර මාස 4-5 වෙන අවස්ථාවක් නැතුව කියලා මට එදා ඉඳන් මට බඩු ගන්න ක්‍රමයක් නැතුව තිබුණා දැන් ගොඩක් සමාන ජීවත් වෙනවා දැක්කියා පස්සේ මේ ඉස්සරහා ගෙදර වැඩ කරනවා ගෙවල් අසීදු දත්තු ගන්නවා මට පඩි හම්බ වෙනවා 10ක්.
In Sri Lanka, where Shanti lives, some of the IMF conditions were to raise fuel and electricity tariffs and taxes on goods. This, on top of an economic crisis that put inflation through the roof, meant daily life for Shanti became simply unaffordable.
රස්සාව ඉඳලා කැපුවන් පස්සේ මස් වර්ගයව ගන්න බැරුව ගියා ඉංග්‍රීසි විලත් වැඩියාවා ඉතින් කරකන් ගියන්නේ නැති ළමයි පන්දරේ පිටිය වෙන්නේ ඉංග්‍රීසි නෑ විශ්වාසෙ විදුලේ නැති නිසා මම ගාම්වලගෙන තමයි ජීවත් වෙන්නේ.
Shanti and her son began relying on relatives to eat, some days not even able to eat 3 meals. They are sleeping in the living room of her mother's house, where her brother and his 2 sons already live.
ඒකොල්ලන් මුගෙන මොනවයි වාස් කියන ලාට මොනවයි දෙනවා වැඩිපුර යාලෙන් තමයි කන්නේ.
Before the IMF came in, Shanti was enrolled in a cash transfer program called Samurdhi. Under the IMF loan, the government has replaced it with a new program called Aswesuma. Many people who used to receive Samurdhi had their benefits withdrawn.
සම්මුතිය මට තිබුණා මේ කාලේ කපලා දැම්මේ මාසෙට 2500ක් තිබුණා මේ මම ඇප්ලිකේෂන් එකක් දැම්මා මේ තාම ප්‍රතිඵලයක්
Programs like Aswesuma that target people based on economic status are prone to errors, arbitrary cutoffs, corruption, and social mistrust. The IMF should encourage governments to instead establish universal systems that provide income support to everyone at critical moments throughout their lives.
ඉතින් මට හැමදාම මේ වැඩ කරලා ඉන්නේ මාන්නේනේ එස්සේ ඉන්නේ පොරොස්සෝල් තියෙනවා එසේ ඔක්කොම තියෙනවා කෙනෙක් යනවා මම ඉතින් අර වැඩක් කරගන්න බෑ මම අර ජීවත් වෙන්න දෙයක් නැති ඉන්න යන්නේ ඔව් මේ ගිනි ගියාට පස්සේ මේ දෙන්නේ ඔක්කොම පණිවට ගන්න මම ඉතින් ගලියට ගන්න නැහැ ඉස්පිතාලේ දෙන්න මේ ටික දීලා ඉන්නවා. Anong paling doon, dati nga lang, matagal na rin siya. Kaya tingin siya yun, yan na po na isi. Daw, tisik ako na ako na Siya magkita mo, it's. Marian, dia man, imi doon na tukay. Para ka na, nibot na. Then, ko na din yung ting magi. Kadiyan mo, magi ito na
The government and IMF should pursue an economic recovery that helps, not hurts people like Shanti.
This has been a week of going to meetings where we hear all sorts of technical language about why governments can't spend more, and sophisticated, or what appears to be sophisticated, analyses of the global economic situation. But I thought it was important to hear from Shanti exactly what this translates to in people's lives. This is one story, but as Shahir noted, the report looks at 3 years worth of loans that affect more than 1 billion people. And Shanti's story, unfortunately, is an all too common one. Half of the loans that I looked at went to African countries, even though on the IMF's board, which approves every loan, African governments have only around 3% share, and share the entire continent shares 2 executive directors. Now, what we tried to do is to assess what the IMF's approach was. And we understand that the IMF comes into situations where there are already existing economic challenges, that they're negotiating loans with governments. But at the same time, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a strong recognition that this would need to be different than the financial recession, that this time the IMF understood that it needed to use its support in a way that actually advanced inclusive and sustainable economies, addressing inequality and climate change. So the idea was to look at what exactly what they're doing, and to sum it up in one sentence, it would be fiscal consolidation while protecting the poor and vulnerable, which a variation of which appears in almost every single program that I looked at. Now, what does that translate to in practice? It means same old, but with a focus on 2 things that are supposed to mitigate the impacts, the acknowledged impacts of the continuing with an approach of austerity that the IMF has long relied on. That is social spending floors and advice to improve social protection systems. This approach is not working. Why? Firstly, because it relies on austerity as the frontline approach, rather than actually putting in place programs or an approach that focuses on or is aligned with human rights, and that enables governments to spend in a way that lets them grow their economies in a way that actually would be effective in reducing debt. One of the ways in which the IMF can do that is by actually assessing the impacts of proposed policies and publishing them so that the public can be a part of that debate. What we know is that the IMF does regularly actually conduct what it calls distributional impact assessments, which is incidentally something that's included in IMF policy advice, but they are not publishing them with a single exception. Secondly, the social spending floors that they include in almost every program have no consistent or objective criteria and are missing key information. Essentially, it is a way of pretending to care about social spending, even though in many cases it actually is decreasing as a percentage of GDP under these programs. And finally, the approach to social protection has been one of emphasizing poverty-targeted programs, even though every other institution has, including the World Bank, has committed to universal social protection systems. The IMF is the exception in claiming to be neutral on this issue, but actually in practice consistently promoting poverty-targeted programs. In the interest of time, I think I will just quickly make one further point, which relates to energy subsidies, which in reality must be removed, but as we saw, because of fossil fuel subsidies, the contribution to climate change. But that said, the way in which the IMF is removing them through using these social spending floors and social approach to social protection that does not actually protect people, what we see is public protests and governments actually restoring these subsidies rather than taking an approach that would actually facilitate the energy transition. Our three recommendations coming from this report, we realize that the IMF is a player in a larger global financial system that needs to be reformed, but three recommendations that we are focusing on from this report is to publish human rights and distributional impact assessments, to redesign social spending floors, and to commit to promoting universal social protection systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. And I would recommend you all to read the report, which really covers like a scope, as Sarah said, of 1 billion population, showing that no different approach is actually taking, and reiterating that like distribution impact assessments are crucial. Changing these social spending floors has to change, and like there's no escape from universal coverage. And now we move to Dr. Isabel, who will present her recent report on budget cuts and austerity measures from 2022 to 2025 based on IMF fiscal expenditure projections in 189 countries until 2022. Dr. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to complement what Sarah says. The report is a report of the End Austerity campaign. You're all welcome to check it online, as well as the Right to Social Security campaign. So these days, we have been surprised to hear from IMF officials that there is no austerity done by the IMF. That was really very shocking, because austerity measures, austerity expenditures cuts are being happened in a majority of world countries. What you have here in this map in red are countries that are contracting public expenditure. And as you can see, the whole world really is on fire. And so you may name it fiscal consolidation, you may name it fiscal discipline, or tightening or rationalizing expenditures, but it is the same old austerity. So this is what is happening. And then in the report, what we did is to investigate what are the areas that are being cut, what are the reforms that happened under these austerity, what are the austerity measures. And we included not only countries with IMF program loans, but also the policy advice with governments that is encountered in Article 4 consultations. And what we have is the most common measure is what Sarah was referring to, is targeting social protection. And this often referred to as improving social protection, which is completely misleading, because it's a de facto contraction of social protection expenditure. What happens is that some people that were covered before, they're left out. Many programs for women, for families, for persons with disabilities are simply cut out, or the benefits reduced, and then just targeted to as a portion of the poor. The second most common measure is cuts or caps to the public sector wage bill. And that means the number or the salaries of civil servants. And normally when in a government you look, which are the majority of the civil servants, are teachers, health workers, civil servants at the local level. All of them play a very important social function, so it has negative social impacts. The third is eliminating subsidies. And then another one is the privatization of public services, which now the word privatization is avoided because it's unpopular. It's only referred to as reform to state-owned enterprises. But that means public transport, energy, water, and many other services that are really necessary for populations. Then there are pension reforms, social security reforms, labor flexibilization reforms, and a very interesting one we saw is the waiving of social security contributions by employers, which is very peculiar because this is done to give a kind of stimulus to enterprises, but of course at the cost of workers. You know, the social security contributions of employers are part of the salary of workers. It's just a salary deferred in time that they will get at the end when they retire. It contributes to their pension. And others. On the revenue side, they're increasing consumption taxes or VAT, encouraging PPPs and fees for public services. And this is in a large number of countries. All these measures, as we explained very quickly, have negative social impacts. The report explained this more in detail, but I want you to show you how overall all these policies are actually pro-rich. It's not that they're pro-poor, they are really pro-rich. So now this will be the distribution of world income. And if you look at the richest, 20% will have most of the income on top, divided men and women. Middle class will have a bit less, working class less. The poor will be the 40% bottom. So they are the poor and the really poorest 20% at the very bottom. Now, all these measures that are with the red arrows, they're really squeezing the incomes of the middle working classes and part of the poor and vulnerable populations. The pension and social security reforms, cuts and privatization to public services, lower wages, increasing VAT, loss of subsidies, and then the compensation measure that is done typically by the IMF or the World Bank, it will be a safety net for a fraction of the poor, which will be this little yellow segment down there. This is completely insufficient because, you know, the majority of populations are being squeezed. And the same applies to the gender strategy of the IMF, which, you know, it states that when women will have detrimental impacts, there will be a mitigating safety net. But obviously, you know, this is going to be completely insufficient because women are half of the world population, and they will need solutions that benefit half of the world population or the country population, not just the little yellow segment down there. This is on targeting, which work by development pathways are going to pass now because Sarah explained it, but I wanted to focus a bit more on social security because this is the topic of today. And what you have here will be the typical social security system on any country, or social protection system is the same. They are regulated by international standards. And what you have at the very bottom for the poor will be a social protection floor. This is a response to the recommendation 202 on social protection floors. It will be social assistance. Then on top, you will have the big chunk, which is really public social insurance, which is mandatory. And this is financed by employers and workers' contributions, typically. And on very top, you have a small percentage for the wealthier populations, which is private savings. That will be private pensions complementary, and anybody can take them if you have savings. But what happens? I want you to reflect, because the IFIs are reducing employers' contributions. So they are making social insurance smaller. Additionally, they're making the benefits, they're cutting benefits of social insurance a lot in any of the different programs. In pensions, for instance, in many countries, old age poverty is growing because the cuts are being so tied to the benefits that, you know, older persons have hardly sufficient income to survive. And then, of course, they're targeting social protection to the poor. All of them are pro-rich policies. So what you will get, it will be this system in which it will be a very tiny social insurance, which will be squeezed and, you know, left to a very minimum. Also a safety net at the bottom for a fraction of the poor. And then the idea, I think, is to force everybody to engage in private systems voluntarily with the financial sector. And now it's always important from a developmental point of view to ask who are the winners and losers of a policy. So obviously here the losers are the majority of citizens, and the winner is the financial sector, who will be getting these private voluntary savings. So this will make inequality to increase, and developmentally is not justified, is against human rights, and it will lead to not achievement of the sustainable development goals. So we do need to rethink these policies that might be caused because of a fiscal crisis. It is very important that we keep thinking in medium and long term and build public systems. The same will happen with privatization of state assets and services. We know that they have negative impacts on public consumer spending, on user fees that raise on the quality of services. PPPs have enormous contingent liabilities too, even talked by the IMF and others. Yes, okay, good. So we know that as these measures have been evolving over time, and this is a work we did on protest in 101 countries, covering 90% of the world population, since measures started to be imposed more seriously after the global financial crisis in 2010, we see an enormous rise on anti-austerity protest on the different topics, from pension reform, food prices, housing, inequality, low living standards, jobs, wages, and others. And we can predict that social conflict is going to increase if these measures are not changed. And the very interesting thing is that there's no need of all this human suffering because there are alternatives to austerity, and they are being applied today by many countries. These are very feasible alternatives available even in the poorest countries. We cannot go into detail here, but let me just name them. The first one, and more obvious, is to increase progressive tax revenues, avoiding VAT or consumption taxes, and going for wealth taxes that are, for instance, considered in Argentina, Iceland, and Spain, taxing with windfall profits in the energy sector or in the banking sector, taxing digital services, mining and gas taxes. And let me give you here an example I always like to give. Mongolia did an universal child benefit with a very, very little tax on copper exports. A beautiful example. Brazil expanded social security with a small financial transaction tax, which it was demoted later on. Anyway, second option will be to fight illicit financial flows that are illegal, like money laundering, tax evasion, trade mispricing, and many others. Third, restructuring and particularly reducing or eliminating debt. And we have very successful cases of countries restructuring debt in earlier years. Fourth, very important for social security, increasing social security contributions, employer contributions to social security to adequate levels, and formalizing workers in the informal economy. Now there are all these people that are informal, bring them back to formality with good contracts. Reallocate public expenditures, and we have countries like Thailand or Costa Rica that they use defense spending to increase social sectors, and others like fiscal and foreign exchange reserves, more accommodating macroeconomic frameworks, lobbying for more aid, and new SDR allocations that could be used to ensure the sustainable development goals and fulfillment of human rights. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Isabel. Another compelling evidence from 185 countries of no different approach, the focus on failing targeting mechanisms and the classic cutting wage bills, eliminating subsidies and increasing VAT. The key message is the policies are still too rich. We now go to Alana to share her insights on the impact of austerity on debt on social security for all in the African context and her alternatives for change.
Thank you. Like I've said throughout these meetings, these institutions, World Bank and IMF, have a very checkered legacy on our continent. And they keep saying that they have changed, they have turned things around, but the more things change, the more they stay the same. The African continent in particular has had no question about where health, education, and social protection should lie. You have to go as far back as the Banjul Charter, the African Union Charter on Human and People's Rights, to show you that even at the time when so many were not thinking about this, it puts certain responsibilities, particularly around social protection. It recognizes you take care of older persons and persons with disabilities. It talks about health, education, and the rights of peoples, not just individuals. But what happens when those grand visions are met with a system in which one, we don't often have power when setting decisions, but two, where we are told we have no money. So as countries, you commit to certain rights, particularly as Africans, and then the IMF and the World Bank are telling you they're not feasible, that you don't have money. On a continent which has so much. I mean, you guys, we have gold, uranium, we have one of the largest workforces, we have the largest market. I feel like I discovered this recently because I grew up being told we were poor. And social protection should only be for the poorest. And I was having a wonderful conversation with a government official today who say it's so crazy how we don't understand how wealthy we are. And for so many, we come and we say, please help us. And we've taken on your debt, and therefore you get to set our conditions. And so for so many countries, the IMF and the World Bank control a lot of things. We set our budgets, but the nitty-gritty is controlled in a lot of ways by those decisions. So when it comes to issues of social spending, of social protection, our social protection systems are rarely financed to the level that they should be by countries. They're left to donors. And Africans are demanding this. If you take a look at our people's manifestos, public services, it's social protection, it is saying we need this. But they're being told, no, you can't spend too much. Sarah talked about the conditions. I can tell you about the extended credit facility, for example. Just the conditions that are there around fiscal consolidation. We no longer use austerity, we use fiscal consolidation. A word which on its face, very few people will understand or complain about, but which means you have to tighten your spending. They will tell you to increase your VAT. So we're hearing the IMF saying, wealth, progressive taxation. But the reality is you always say use VAT, which is an informal tax, an indirect tax, which affects the woman buying oil or whatever it is, regardless of your status, it affects the poor more. And that means that social spending, particularly around public services, health, education, social protection, is just it's like a foregone conclusion that it should never be enough. And yet COVID-19 showed us that in a lot of these countries, we need social spending more than ever. And that actually, in the wealthier countries, some of the countries who are big stakeholders in these institutions, they were increasing their social spending, but for us, we're continuously told our hands were tied. And the impact of that is a continuous cycle of people just being trapped in poverty. So for an institution that is trying to curb and end poverty, your very same policies are resulting in that. And people are living without dignity. The story on the video is a story so many face. And now continent, it's worse because for older persons, for example, you find many of them are paying for the education of their grandkids from the little social assistance grants they're getting. So when you target that, you don't just harm the older person, you harm the ability of young persons to be able to access education or healthcare. And for me, the central question in all of this is where is our voice, where are our leaders? But above all, why should we let a few institutions determine what policies of the people, what is the legitimacy of this social contract? And for countries particularly that are in fragile contexts that are heavily indebted, I was talking to an official from one of them today. One of them told me that they were told they could not hire any new people. There were freezes, not just on wages, but on the hiring, and they could not have any program that required money. And I said, but you were going through COVID-19, and in that particular country, this Russia-Ukraine crisis has affected their food insecurity. And he said, you can't possibly imagine what it means to have your hands tied. Your people are looking to you, and there's not much you are doing. So on our end, we want to see this a real redefinition of a real focus on social spending and recognizing that we're still tying conditionalities, we're still bringing in the problematic thinking that got us here is still being disguised and it's here. And on the other hand, we're being given little, I think of them as, I liked what Human Rights Watch report says about a band-aid and a bullet wound. Like when you come and tell us to target our social protection, when you say, oh, we're going to allow some social spending flaws, I mean, you're giving us the bare minimum that is not addressing the problem. Because when COVID-19 comes, your people need social protection across strata. So where do you start with your targeting of social protection? How do you even track them with our huge informal sector? And then how do you then wake up and say social spending flows? And I think I want to talk about the social spending flows. My country is one of the lucky that has I think, define social spending flows in terms of, they at least say there should be social spending flows on health, education, social protection. And ISER had a lot of engagement when they were doing the extended credit facility, and I think that's probably why they added them. But then when the government doesn't meet them, the next disbursement still comes. So then I wonder what exactly, so we have the social spending flows in theory, they are not met, and even then there is no requirement to tie them to any sort of minimum benchmarks that we have already agreed upon. So it's a cycle. We are really looking for some change. We think, I completely agree with Isabella, that there are more sustainable ways to do this, and we need to actually make the wealthy pay their fair share of tax, and have, if the IMF wants to help, include that in some of those agreements. They talk about illicit financial flows. They will say, yes, we've helped you pass this legislation. But we were talking earlier on this week about how some of the IFC investments, for example, could be contributing to illicit financial flows. So we have an institution that is at this point a huge part of the problem. And I don't know yet that they are alive to that reality or willing to change. And I think for the African governments in particular, they made certain commitments, right from the Banjul Charter to the recent protocol on social protection, which is, I think, fantastic because it recognizes that social protection is tied to health and education, and it's looking at a whole system of really cushioning people. So they have these commitments, and ISER litigates, and we engage at those levels. So we need them to actually be able to come back in their negotiations with the IMF and World Bank and say, sorry, to do this would mean that I have to violate commitments that I made, that we made as a continent. And as I think this fight is ultimately a fight among people. She said that, and we were talking about this yesterday as well, that inequality, that the lack of social spending and social protection is going to breed strife. We don't have to look too far. You can look at Kenya, the protests that were happening in Kenya. So I really think that it's a fight that all of us should be involved in. You may think that because you're getting some money right now, it's something that affects the poor. But the reality is you're either a medical bill away from poverty, or just something, you know, some countries somewhere decide to fight, and suddenly your economies are rocked and your people are rocked. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Again, another indication of how nothing's changing. We are told that we have no money, but we should forget how wealthy we are. And Elena again raises the question of legitimacy, something that we need to all think about. Who has the right to condition our governments and our societies to invest in their social security and to reach equality? We now move the floor online to Dr. Rodrigo Cerda to share his reflections on the effectiveness of the IMF approach to social security amidst rising debt and increasing austerity measures. It's now the chance to hear from the IMF that we've been critiquing so far in this panel. Dr. Rodrigo, I don't know if you hear us, but the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can hear. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah,
yeah. And I hope also
10
that.
minutes.
Thank you. So I'm not sure that I understand the presentation is on the screen.
To share your reflections on social security measures of the IMF.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. No, just want to check if my presentation can be seen on the screen.
Not yet. No.
Not yet. Okay. Okay. So, well, let me start anyway, and I hope you can see it.
Now we can see it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, great. So let me start with the next slide, which is my first one. On that slide, which I hope you can see it as soon as possible. Well, the first thing is that at the IMF, we think that the social spending plays a key role in supporting sustained and inclusive growth. And to do so, we have been developing a social spending strategy. And well, as you can see, while this social spending strategy starting or has a first public document in 2019, and our approach in that sense is that, well, of course, we're an institution that we're focused on economics outcomes, and we try to have a sustained growth over time. So while our focus to the problem is on the macro critical side, and we try to assess whether social spending is, in one hand, adequate. So it's adequate to reach social targets. Also, if it's efficient, in the sense that, well, you are compared with peers in other countries while you are spending efficiently. And finally, I think it's also very important that it should be fiscally sustainable. And in that sense, well, if it will have a benefit, we expect that that benefit could be sustained over time. So we try to incorporate those principles in our advice to different countries, and this is what we are trying to develop. So in the next slide, what you can see is that, well, even though this was our first starting document on social spending, in the social spending strategy, we have been later on developing guidance notes to better guide us our engagement on social spending. So we have already published 2 of those guidance notes. One is on pensions, another is on social safety net, and we expect to be also publishing notes on health spending and educational spending in the next, hopefully, fiscal year. We usually work in those notes, those guidance notes for our staff, but in very strong collaboration with other institutions. So usually we have been working, we get comments from the World Bank, from the ILO, also from the WFP, trying to of course, to have a good comment on that. And we also have been interacting with many of with some of CSOs, and we hope to continue in that sense. So next slide, please. So just to remember that the funds engage with countries in different activities. We have 3 main activities. One is surveillance, the second is programs or lendings, and finally capacity development. Okay, so here we just want to show one example, and these are all public documents. This is an example of surveillance engagement in Madagascar. So what we can see in this document, it was mainly advised to boost fiscal space for higher social spending, also combined with institutional reform to ensure a more efficient use of resources. So my point here is that when we try to focus on IMF engagement on social spending, I think that we also need to not just to look on lending, but also look also to other engagement we may have. One of those usually that we have is surveillance. And as you can see in this case, well, what we were looking for is to boost fiscal space for higher social spending. Next slide, please. Well, no, maybe just to stop. No, maybe if you can go back just to show what we did in that case. If you can look to Madagascar, well, that when we were looking to other peers countries and we compare social spending, well, in that case, of course, it was much more delayed in terms of spending, social spending, and that was the reason that we asked for, or we tried to create fiscal space to get higher social spending. Another question is, how do we get, or how do we are able to have a larger fiscal space? But just give me a minute, and I will go back to that question. Next slide, please. So another way to engage on social spending is lending. Okay. And while this is also a case, this is Mauritania in 2023. And yes, as you can see here, we have two type of metrics for social spending. In one way, we have the social spending floor, which was what we were discussing. But also, well, we need to be aware that we may have some other ways to approach, not just using social spending floors. There are some other ways that we can also try to work on this. One of those might be structural benchmarks, which sometimes are not quantitative floors, but where you're required to implement different reforms. And the reason that we have those structural benchmark is that sometimes, well, we need to develop some new ways to reach to people. In that case, here in Mauritania, what we're seeing is that we were asking also to increase the amount of spending per people in those in social spending. Next slide, please. And the third way we engage with countries is through capacity development. This is another report that we provide, and this is on energy pricing. Okay,
Dr. Rodrigo, sorry to interrupt. Have 2 minutes, please.
Okay. And what I think is important here to show is that in that report, that it's also very public, what we show is that large part of subsidies, almost 1/3 of subsidies, in that case on fuel subsidies, was just obtained by the largest income decile. So, of course, when we think in that sense, reforming, making the reform of fuel subsidy also is some kind of thinking that we need to use those resources not for the richest, but for all people that require much more resources. So, in that sense, also thinking on reforming energy fuel subsidies, well, what we're thinking is on the distributional impacts on that. And in that case, what we show here, and this is what we usually do on capacity development, is that large part of the subsidy were obtained by the richest people in the economy. Next slide, if I have the time, please.
Yeah, just 1 minute, please. Yeah.
Okay, so this is also some of our advice on education and health, because social spending, well, I was just talking about direct benefits, but here also we have some education and health. We may talk later. So please, if next slide. But the real problem here, and maybe this is my last thought, and then we can continue the discussion, is that when we look to different countries, and this is on thinking on fiscal space to be able to provide social spending. Well, when we look to low-income developing countries, and this is a paper that was published very recently by our tax policy division, we see that countries in low-income economy has revenues that are very low. Here we're talking about just 14 points of GDP, okay? And of course, when you have so low revenues, it's very difficult to have a very developed system to provide social spending to people. The good things, though, is that at least in this paper, what we show is that the potential capacity to increase tax revenues is large in those countries. Okay, and we can discuss which are the ways we can do it, but at least in this paper we show that we might try to increase tax capacity in almost 9 points of GDP. 9 points of GDP is a large amount of revenue, which may allow also to provide fiscal space to think on increasing social spending. So the point here is that probably what we need is a strategy in which we have some medium-term revenue strategy in which we increase revenue, which allow us to think on increased sustainable social spending in the future. So let me stop here and then we continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rodrigo, and for sharing the insights of IMF, how they look into social security, trying to check how adequate, efficient, and financially sustainable the different mechanisms IMF use, whether technical notes or surveillance or lending mechanisms, and capacity development. It's also very interesting to share the issue of low tax revenues. I think the issue is like how to get the taxes. Is it the VAT as classically, or there are other sources of revenues and taxes that we've heard from different things related to progressive tax, and as Dr. Isabel mentioned in her alternatives. We will now open the floor for questions. I've seen that we don't have a good habit of that, but to stick for less than 1 minute in a question, just to take as many questions as possible. And then we will do like several rounds depending on the time that we have available for us. So the floor now is open for questions, whoever wants to raise a point. Okay. I mean,
we have additional things to say.
Yeah, we can perhaps ask to Rodrigo.
There's something that
you want to, okay, maybe we'll take a
Okay.
round of reflections to Dr. Rodrigo's comments from the panelists, and then we will open the floor of, thank you, sorry, Hannah. Yeah, Elena, you can have
I
2 minutes.
was glad to hear Dr. Rodrigo say that there's a lot of potential to increase our revenues and therefore get the money. My challenge is you keep prescribing the same things. You prescribe VAT as an indirect tax, which is not going to fetch that much revenue, and you let the wealthy in many of our countries, you don't engage with our governments on that particular issue, or really see substantive change there. But the thing that I do want to hear from you all is, if you truly believe that these social services and this social protection is so important, then why do you through austerity measures actually undermine them? I mean, for example, you could say tighten belts, and you could say, because we strongly believe in social spending flows, we are saying ring fence any cuts to certain areas, they will not be touched. Because the impact of what you're doing means that last year in Uganda, they had tried to increase education. Then after Parliament and the democratic process has done increases in that area, you sit a few officials in Ministry of Finance and decide spending won't be released on time, certain cuts will be made. And it meant that teachers there were not additional hires of teachers. Ministry of Education officials were working in shifts. It took us shouting to get that. So why do you not actually, if you know what is supposed to be working, why aren't you doing it? Particularly around making sure that there's progressive taxation with the wealthy paying their fair share of tax.
Dr. Isabel?
Yes, I would like to thank Dr. Rodrigo Cerda for all the discussion on the strategies, the guidance notes, and my first comment is going to be there. And it is true that IMF, and we thank the IMF for that, sends these drafts for comments to different international organizations. But the key thing here, and I was director of Social Security and ILO, the key thing is that the comments should be incorporated. I spent a humongous amount of time in the social spending strategy, and virtually no comment was incorporated. So this is an important thing. It's not just send something and then not listen back. But appreciate the effort, and I think that the suggestion here is that this needs to continue in a better and more enforced way. And with regards to the country level programs, surveillance, and capacity development, thanks for the examples given, which were good examples. But as we know, this is not the most general examples. The most general examples follow really a blueprint, which is all the policies I was presenting before. The targeting social protection, wage bill cuts or caps, eliminating subsidies, commercialization, or reform of state-owned enterprises, pension and social security reforms, etc. So will it be possible, and that will be the petition to the IMF, to please do some ex-ante social impact assessment? I know that the answer is always say that this comes in a moment of crisis and it's difficult to do, but in reality, a good social impact assessment from a national expert can be done in a week. So you can get, and there are things that are pretty obvious. If you are going to cut social protection programs for families, women, or persons with disabilities, they're going to have negative impact, no matter you do a little safety net for a percentage of the poor. So these, the social ex-ante social impact assessment will be very important at country level. And the second one is that we need really to push more aggressively for options, for financing options, for alternative fiscal space. And so it needs to be pushed more aggressively. And for that, it might be better to have national dialogue. And national dialogue is part of good governance, is prescribed by the UN, and is in all international conventions. And this is getting together, discussing all these issues publicly. It cannot be that decisions that affect the lives of millions of people are taken behind closed doors. They need to be discussed publicly and with relevant stakeholders, employers, trade unions, civil society organizations, government, and all together put the pros and cons and then decide whether it will be better for the country, but not behind closed doors. It's not a technocratic decision. It affects the lives of too many people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Isabel. Sarah, for 2 minutes, please.
Very, very quickly. Thank you, Dr. Serda, for the presentation. I want to add my own frustration. We're at the annual meetings. The idea is to actually take a step back and reflect on the IMF's approach and not simply explain the IMF's approach. I understand very well what the IMF does. The question is, are you satisfied that it is working to ensure that recoveries protect the vast majority of the population rather than shift the burden onto them, while the people who benefited from the system that produced the crisis are left to continue to benefit from it? So it's actually a moment to take a step back and think through whether the IMF's approach is working. And I would love to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
Maybe since we've taken questions from the floor to Dr. Serda, if you're alive, maybe we can respond to these questions first, and then we open the floor for further questions.
Open the floor.
Dr. Serda, I'm not sure if you're online or can hear us.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. So yeah, the questions were revolving on alternatives, fiscal options, pushing for national dialogue. Yeah, the process of dialogue in general, also the reflections of the current approaches that you've presented. Do you feel that these current approaches of the IMF on social spending has been reaching its goals, has been reaching the coverage, have been supporting those who get impacted by the different crises? So yeah, maybe you can have more than like 2 minutes. So I'll give you 5 minutes to engage with these questions, then we can open the floor back to the participants.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, so let me start by the question on the revenue side. I think it's a very important question. Yeah, I would say that when we're talking about this medium-term revenue strategy, okay, which should allow to increase our tax capacity, I think that we need to think very in different instruments. Yeah, and of course, one of those is taxation. Okay, and when we think on taxation, we can think on two different ways at least. One on the tax levels, and second on the base of the tax. And let me start by the base of the tax. I think that there is and this is part of the work that the IMF staff has been doing with different countries, there is also a lot of room to look for a larger base. And when we talk about larger base, one of the things we're talking about is about tax expenditures. There is in a lot of countries, I would say, mainly every country, a lot of sectors or some sectors that are exempt from taxation for different reasons, okay? And these are what we talk about tax expenditure. So probably one of the things we should try to look is also to look more closely to those and to see if those exemptions are justified or not. And if we can, of course, look for more revenues from those sectors that are exempt, is one thing. The second thing is about different taxes on tax levels and so on. So in that sense, well, usually, well, we focus on discussing VAT, but also when we look to different IMF programs, I think that you can see that there are other sorts of revenues that we also advise. For example, corporate income taxation or having a more progressive personal income taxation is one of the things that we usually also do. And when we're talking about also about personal income taxation, it's not just the tax level, but it's also the different type of taxes you may have. So, for example, you may have taxes on dividends that are not that may not exist at one moment, and we can try to also to ask for those. And when you look to programs, and when I'm talking about programs, I'm talking about the memorandum of understanding that usually a program has between the IMF and the different country authorities. Well, you will see that we have in many cases increases on in corporate income taxation, personal income taxation, tax dividends, and so on. So up to this moment, I have been talking about the base, the level of taxes and different taxes, but something that I haven't talked to about is about revenue administration, and this is something that also we need to look very closely, and this is also something that it is on memorandum of understandings. And revenue administration, I think, is very important because in some way for this similar level of taxes, well, you can try to see why you are not getting the revenue you should, and modernizing revenue administration is another way to work, and that is also pushed in our programs. Yeah, so
there's other questions related to social impact assessments and other questions related to pushing for social dialogue and moving the discussion out of the technical scope and engaging society. And like, if you can address those in the next minute or two, please, and then we can open the floor for.
Okay. So yeah, so capacity development is quite relevant. Okay, and it's quite relevant. Why? Because usually when you have also programs with countries, and here we're just talking about countries that are under lending. We could also talk about other countries, but let's talk about those ones. Well, usually what you have with them is some understanding of different measures, but later on you need to make the implementation of those measures. And again, coming to the MOUs that we have with countries, in those MOUs, what we also have is that we're going to have capacity development later to implement those measures. So, for example, on fuel subsidies, okay, that sometimes are on programs as a measure that need to be implemented. Usually what we do is that when we are going to implement those measures, or the country is going to implement those measures, usually we have later on a mission coming from the IMF going to the country and trying to see much more closely to the impact of the reform and on the distributional impact of that reform. And of course, in that sense, we provide also to the country authorities with a report on that and what are the implications, and to take the best decision in that sense. So I would say that that's why we also focus so much in our advice, saying that, well, capacity development should be done during those the implementation of the program. So the distributional impact in that sense, the way we try to look much more closely is in that capacity development period or process that is later on. So let me stop here.
Okay.
To have more questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rodrigo. And it seems from the answer that you're still satisfied with the process of how it's taking place. Let's hear more questions from Kate. Sorry.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. Thank you all. And I had a question for Dr. Cerda regarding your programming. So as you just acknowledged, your programs tend to emphasize VAT, which is at odds with, of course, the IMF's assessment that regressive taxation has a negative impact on growth because it depresses domestic demand, which precludes the ability to establish enough growth to get debt to a sustainable level. And that's tied up with a lot of these austerity measures. But on the social protection side of things, the IMF has found that in order to unwind fuel subsidies, you need an extended period of time and to build out the mitigation measures to communicate with the public. And generally speaking, these are implemented in a very different way that are much more aggressive and quick. And oftentimes there's a complete failure to synchronize the standing up of social protection that actually achieves a comprehensive level of coverage for the population before the implementation of the subsidy removal. So the result is that there's an extended period of time, several years, if not decades, where there's a vulnerable population or the entire population left without adequate social protection, but dealing with the extraordinary increase in the cost of living that comes with the subsidy reductions and VAT imposition and other inflationary pressures that are often tied to IMF programs. Don't you think that it would be better if those programs were better synchronized so that social protection was stood up first before you start to unwind all of these protections? Otherwise, you're basically leaving millions, tens of millions, depending on the size of the population, of people without any adequate social protection while they suffer and endure further battering economically due to the design of the program and the conditionality built around it. And just finally, one last thing, you often say that you want progressivity in the tax code, but ultimately we don't see it as a condition in most of these programs. We see dependence on the VAT, and officials will say it's a sovereign decision. But in reality, you say no when a government says that they don't want to remove fuel subsidies. You can say no if they propose a regressive tax structure. You can insist, because you see it as macro critical, and your writing shows that they have a progressive tax structure as a fundamental aspect of the revenue plan built into the program design. And I wonder if you would be willing to make a transition in that direction.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for this great panel. My name's Kate Donald. I work for Oxfam, so I understand how difficult it is sometimes to break down silos between issues in a big organization. But I want to express my frustration that we're still seeing, after many, many years of civil society pointing out that the IMF is doing one thing with one hand and another with the other. And Tim, I think, just illustrated this well as well. We're still not seeing those two hands coordinating well. I mean, the IMF research department is showing very clearly that austerity doesn't work even on the IMF's own terms, but we're still seeing it show up in loan programs. We're seeing this kind of promising initiative towards social spending floors, but we're still seeing, like, for example, some Oxfam numbers that we just crunched show that for every $1 that the IMF is recommending countries to protect in terms of social spending, it's cutting $6 through other means. We're also seeing this in the gender strategy. We see a very siloed gender strategy, which recommends kind of like small programs that might protect women's incomes and livelihoods, but we're not looking at the big bread and butter issues of IMF policy and conditionality externalities and how those are impacting on women's rights. So I would love Rodrigo Cerda, please, to kind of reflect on how the IMF can better coordinate among its different functions and departments to make sure it's really kind of walking the talk. Thank you.
Yeah, question at the back.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Amr Ramadan from Alexandria, Egypt. I'm a climate justice advocate and social entrepreneur. So a few months ago, I gave a TED talk. It was in a TED official event with the name Can Carbon Tax Achieve Climate Justice? And I'm pro-carbon tax and I'm pro-wealth taxation. And I believe that the private sector need to pay the price of pollution, which is a big externality, and also the need to pay the wealth taxation to avoid the accumulation of wealth and to achieve income equality. But I have something that I would love to share with, that who is going to do that? And simply the answer should be the government. But in some countries which the government are democratically elected in undemocratic way, how can we guarantee that those policies are going to be implemented in a meaningful way? Because in many countries which democracy has no place, there is kind of a high intersection and interconnectedness between the government and private sector. A lot of ministers, they have private companies and people, they are in the parliament or they are elected. So, I mean, I'm afraid that when those policies are applied or implemented in undemocratic countries, it's going to lead to a catastrophic collapse. I have this concern inside myself. Even I'm pro-carbon taxation.
What's the question?
The question is, how can we guarantee that those policies could be implemented on a global basis? Because those could be successful if they are implemented in a democratically elected government, okay? When government are elected by people, and those governments are going to meaningfully implement wealth taxation, carbon taxation, and other amazing ideas. But in undemocratic situation, how this is going to happen?
Maybe we can take one more question if they're on the floor, and then we can go back to the. Okay, I guess there's no. Maybe if you want to engage with any of these questions, or we go to Dr. Ras.
I think they are all for
Dr.
Right. Rodrigo Cerda.
So again, Dr. Rodrigo, another set of questions related to the synchronizations of the programs of the IMF. Why is there no pressure on progressivity of tax revenues if there is an interest on that? How does the IMF coordinate between different functions related to social spending and fiscal well-being? And there was the last question on carbon tax and wealth tax for climate change, and what's the position of IMF on that? So.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, on the progressivity of taxation, I think that I would say that when we look to different programs and in that sense, I think it's not just looking to memorandum of understanding, but also with the documents that are with different programs. I think that you can see that we're trying to push for much more on those progressive taxation, on CIT, on also on PIT and so on, and of course I think at least on low income countries, as I said before, we think that there is still a lot of space to have much more revenues, and those type of taxation are probably one of that we try to focus much more. But again, there are other type of revenues that we can also try to push, that are revenues and so on. Revenue administration is also very important. I mean, when we think on different countries, and sometimes what you see is that people might try to shift their taxation from one country to another just to look for lower taxation and so on. Well, revenue administration is also very important to try to to try to avoid that, to try to also to get taxation in the right country and so on. On the fuel subsidies and the transition and how we coordinate with the social protection infrastructure, I very much agree with the remark, in the sense that part of our advice is also to try to build the social spending infrastructure to be able to compensate people when we make the fuel subsidy reform. And this is very important because, as I was showing in the case of Colombia before, well, in Colombia we can see that on the fuel subsidy, almost 30% of the fuel subsidy just went to the 10% of the richest. Of course, I think it makes sense to make the fuel subsidy reform in that sense. But of course, if we're going to make poor people not in a good condition, we need to compensate them. And to do so, we need to have the social infrastructure to reach to those people. So I think that it's a good remark that, and this is part of our advice, that we need to have or to build this infrastructure in advance of doing the fuel subsidy reform. And of course, doing a good communication and so on. Concerning the coordination within the IMF, which is another question I had. Yeah, what I would say that this is one of the reasons it's so important that part of the implementation of the programs, of the lending programs, is done with capacity development that happens later on during the implementation of the programs. We're trying to do that as much as possible. And in that sense, we think that there's a good coordination between area departments and the functional department, in this case, FID, trying to provide the best implementation of the programs. And while we're working on that, and of course, if we can improve on that, we will continue with. But we're trying to, and this is one of the reasons that the IMF has been trying to increase the capacity development we are providing to countries. And that is the reason that we just do not focus just on surveillance and lending, but also we need to focus on capacity development. And in that sense, please let me talk just a point about something I didn't talk before, which is on the PFM side. The PFM side, which is also something that we do a lot in capacity development, is very important, because PFM side is one way of using correctly and efficiently our resources, and also is a way of providing more transparency to the use of resources. And it is another way in which we might try to fight and to try to provide help in any anti-corruption initiative that country might try to do. So this is something that we also try to do in capacity development, and we are trying to expand as much as possible in that sense. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rodrigo. I think we can come to our concluding remarks. Maybe we can start from Elena, and then Dr. Isabel, and then Sarah, and then we give the floor back to Dr. Rodrigo. Elena, I have 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, I think we often forget as people that these are rights, they are entitlements. And when our governments leave them to the whims of institutions or markets, then we lose sight of what's really at stake. So for me, it's actually a call, particularly to the young people. There's a young man I met today from Somalia who lives in Morocco. He's at the back. And we were talking about how for so many of us, particularly on the continent, even if you chose to sit back and remain removed from these discussions and just make your money, you will never enjoy your money. You will have to pay for education or health for your people. You will be the social protection that the government should be providing. And then you will still, and yet in so many ways, we don't see as much pushback. So I think part of what we're trying to do as well here is to remind you all that you all have a stake in these conversations around pushing back against austerity, around the fact that we're not investing enough in our public services or in things like social protection, and that you must speak up. And I think that the IMF, and we've talked a lot how some of the international financial institutions arguably do have certain obligations as well. Number one, to do no harm at minimum. And so from your policies to make sure that you may talk about, oh, it's a lack of policy coherence or a lack of, no, there are real impacts. As you're trying to figure out what you're doing with one arm doing this and the other doing that, someone is lacking social protection and healthcare and education. And I think that COVID and this crazy time we're living in has taught us that more than ever, we need more inclusive societies, and social spending, social protection, public services are key for that, and ameliorating inequality. And the IMF and World Bank should really get back to their mission, because I think you've deviated so much and chosen to focus on what is not possible. And we're encouraging you to work with us as civil society on what we think is possible. Particularly, and when it comes to African continent, it's not just even like wealth taxes, it's like harnessing those mineral realities and all the stuff that we have to actually make sure we can deliver more equitable societies, and recognizing that because you have so much power, you don't get to sit behind closed doors and make decisions that affect the rest of us. That time should be done.
Thank you, Alana. Dr. Isabel.
Thank you. Continuing with Alana's words, I'm really looking forward for the day that we will see IMF advised to be a hardliner with governments and pressure on increasing financial resources to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, proposing new progressive tax revenues, restructuring or eliminating debt, fighting illicit financial flows, increasing social security contributions, etc. And then to ensure that the IMF advice will increase social security coverage and benefits, public services, and through ensure better living standards, prosperity for all, and fulfillment of human rights. That will be really a good moment that the advice will come to that level.
Thank you, Dr. Isabel. Sarah.
Thank you. I have four concluding thoughts. The first is I want to say it's a real shame that the World Bank declined our invitation to speak. Very often in speaking with IMF staff, we are told that they focus on the macro, and that issues around particularly social security, social protection are the domain of the World Bank. In speaking with the World Bank, they say that they are constrained by IMF targets. And so it would have been a real opportunity to have both institutions represented on this panel, and it is really a shame that the World Bank chose not to join. The second is that very often we are given reasons for why the things that we're arguing for, everybody agrees that would be better, but we can't, or it's not possible, or it isn't happening for X, Y, and Z reason, because of governments, because of the bank, because of the fund's mandate. There are a lot of reasons for failure, but the stakes are much too high for failure. And so we need to come up with better policies that have better outcomes. The third is you cannot mitigate your way out of the impacts of austerity. Austerity is fundamentally a logic that shifts the burden of recovery onto those who are struggling the most, rather than putting the burden on those who had benefited from the system that led to the crisis in the first place. Social spending floors, social protection, all of these have their place. They're not designed well. It's a separate issue, but they are not a response to austerity. And the final point is that rather than explaining the process that leads to the outcome and accepting the outcomes, we should begin with the outcome we want and design processes that deliver them. This means that we constantly assess what the outcome of the policies are, and if they are not achieving the outcomes we want, we redesign them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Then, Dr. Rodrigo, you have 2 minutes, please.
No, well, thank you for letting me explain what we do. And And also, just my last thought on this, where we engage with the CSO in these annual meetings and also spring meetings usually. But also, I would like to say that during the year, we also try to engage and with CSO, not so publicly, but we have some meetings and we try to also to listen and to reflect on our policy. So from that point of view, well, I think that we value a lot those these meetings and we try to improve in of course in our policies. We try to do our best work as possible. We know that this is a very important role we have, and in that sense, we are always trying to make the best of our work, and we will try to continue doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rodrigo, and thanks again, Sarah, Dr. Isabel, and Elena for your valuable contributions. It seems that still we have a way of discussion between the international financial institution and civil society, but we have no other option but to keep fighting for social security for all. Thank you for your patience and your time, and we hope to see you in other events. Thanks.